President Xi Jinping, continuing his unprecedented international outreach exemplifying China's rise, has just participated in the second summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Johannesburg, South Africa, a first on the African continent. And the whole world is paying attention. Why now? For decades, Africa has been a prime focus of China's international strategy. So why has the world woken up only recently? What is China doing in Africa? What kinds of commercial activities? Natural resources, infrastructure? Why are some Western countries concerned? Are there political implications? What about the African countries themselves? Did The Economist get it right, writing, Africans are asking whether China is making their lunch or eating it? There is appreciation, sure, but there is also anxiety. Going to Africa brings us closer to China.
China will provide a financial package of $60 billion to support 10 major proposed projects across Africa in the next 3 years. That's the commitment Chinese President Xi Jinping made at the second summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Johannesburg. He also expressed his hopes that China and Africa will continue to deepen ties.
中方将秉持真实亲诚对非政策理念和正确的义利观，同非洲朋友携手迈向合作共赢、共同发展的新时代。为此，我提议将中非新型战略伙伴关系提升为全面战略合作伙伴关系。
For decades, China has regarded Africa as an important partner for development. In March 2013, 10 days after taking office, President Xi Jinping visited 3 African countries. Since October 2000, Chinese leaders have paid 149 visits to African countries, and 379 African leaders have visited China.
China has had a unique approach in Africa, and it's really an important one. It's certainly helpful for China, and there's nothing wrong with that. But to explore Africa from their point of view, I mean, there are different voices. I mean, some Africans are concerned that by selling raw materials and importing manufactured goods, it creates a permanent dependency.
For this kind of raw materials, I would say that's an issue of human being, not just Africa, not just Latin America. So we should work together. But for China's doing in Africa, actually, the senior researcher Erica Downs in Brookings, she wrote an article about China's mining oil industry in Africa, and she concluded that China's investment in oil in Africa two types. One is those spots places where they left over by the West oil companies, and the second is those war zones and unsafe places. But actually, for the manufactured goods, that also I think the former National Bank President of National Bank of Nigeria, he criticized China in some in an article in Financial Times, talking about that,
deindustrialization,
exactly.
and maintaining an underdevelopment because of this perpetual imbalance.
His complaint or criticism is partly true, but an interesting case is that in 2006, the Premier Wen Jiabao visited South Africa. There was a big cry for the breakdown of the textile industry in South Africa. So Wen Jiabao said, all right, we'll stop 31 categories of textile products for 2 years. So we voluntarily curtail China's export to South Africa. But you think, when China stopped the export to Africa, How about Bangladesh? How about the Vietnamese? How about Malaysia?
We have the same argument
Exactly.
in the U.S. about China imports, because if it's not for China, it would be Mexico or something.
So that's some South African scholars. They realize that. So that's not your problem. That's our problem. We should upgrade our industry.
When you visit some African or Latin American countries, you would know that China is trying to help build new industries there on the basis of our own economic development and our cooperation in energy. But we are all aware that developing new industries in other countries requires that they meet certain conditions. If China doesn't see that country well in place for further development, we cannot do it. After all, it is about economic behavior. But we will not hesitate once we see the conditions ready. Over the years, the world has seen China's involvement in certain countries. For example, we have started cooperation with certain countries, advancing their telecommunications industry, developing their infrastructure, innovating new kinds of chemical products, promoting industrial manufacturing, etc. Because we see those countries well prepared for our help. So we should recognize certain elements of truth in the media coverage, but their report doesn't show the bigger picture. In most cases, our leaders visited certain countries and saw their problems for real, and then they put forward measures to help address the problems. For example, when President Xi Jinping visited Africa, he proposed what he believed to be the correct views on righteousness and benefit, pointing out that we should give more benefits to other developing countries.
A good case is Huajian shoe making factory. At the end of 2011, the former Prime Minister in Ethiopia visited China, and Justin Yi Fuling took him to the south and visited the Huajian shoe factory. It's making female shoes. He said, look, they have to import leathers all over the world, also from Ethiopia. Why not let them to build a factory in your country? So immediately, the former Prime Minister says, okay. So at the end of 2011, the factory started, and in March, it started produce the shoes, and they exported to US and Europe.
Located in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia is one of the least developed countries in the world. According to the World Bank, Ethiopia's GDP per capita was less than $600 in 2014. But the country is going through great transformation. Investment from China is one catalyst for change. Meseret Girma has been working in the stitching department at Huajian Cooperate in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, for 2.5 years. She's satisfied with her work.
Day by day, I have changed something, and I change from my position, even my salary, everything is changed day by day. So I feel happy. That's why I still work in Huajian.
Huajian is one of the largest manufacturers of women's shoes in the world. Its factory in Ethiopia produces shoes that are exported to US and European markets under brand names like Mark Fisher. The president of Huajian Group, Zhang Huarong, said his company invested in Ethiopia not only to cut labor costs by about 10%, but also to be a key contributor to the country's economy.
One of our biggest contributions is that we employed over 4,000 local people, so they have stable jobs and salaries. What's more important is to overturn the mistaken idea worldwide that manufacturing in Africa is no good. As long as you have a good corporate culture, good training system, and attitude to share with other people, you can build a good company in Africa.
Huajian is one of the first investors in Ethiopia's Eastern Industry Zone. Its success has helped attract 36 manufacturing enterprises, most of them Chinese.
In our planning, we give a substantial focus to attract foreign direct investment across the world, and especially from China.
Many say Africa is the next frontier for economic development. Essential will be technical and financial support from companies like Huajian.
There is the critique that you hear that, well, the projects are going to be built by Chinese companies, and these are going to instill Chinese influence and values in those countries, expand its political influence, maybe be a place to send its overcapacity industry in steel or cement or whatever those things can be. I mean, so there are critiques that you read about.
Sure, and that's nothing new. I mean, you can also make the same critiques about projects that, say, the Americans or the Japanese are pushing on some train projects or similar projects. So it's nothing new in that sense. It's not shocking. But in the end, what really matters is whether such projects went through the same kind of rigorous vetting and transparent bidding. And if they're the best, if they're the cheapest, if the Chinese companies are the best choices, why not? And I think that's what people just simply expect.
The Economist ran an editorial a couple of years ago, I think, and it very provocatively said something to the effect that what is China doing in Africa? Is it buying the Africans' lunch, or is it eating the African lunch? Which is kind of a cheeky way to kind of poke China about what it's doing, because either way, it's not a very nice thing. Either you're paying for it, in a patronizing way, or you're eating it, meaning you're stealing. You're eating their lunch. It's a phrase in English. And so, how do you react to it?
To make an assessment of China's doing in Africa, the best, the assessor is Africans. I once read some comments on an article. It's very interesting. Somebody makes some argument against China, okay? So they take natural resources and that's an old traditional Western way, blah, blah. And then another one said, yes, China took a lot of natural resources in Africa, but they left hospitals, railways, roads, primary schools. The West took much more natural resources. They left only wars.
China has been a very good partner as far as Mauritius is concerned. We have benefited many grants and, of course, many interesting loans as well. And China has helped us tremendously.
We have engaged FOCAC with equal opportunities from both sides. I think there is mutual respect.
Chinese government and people are well aware that a sustainable relationship between Africa and China is if it is win-win. And China has no aspiration to neo-colonize Africa.
For us in Tanzania, we lack technicians. We lack also financially, we need more support from our friends from the country like China.
China is committed to facilitating Africa's economic development. Through October 2015, China has supported African countries in building some 5,600 kilometers of railways and 4,500 kilometers of highways. Joint projects have produced 64 power plants, 18 bridges, 12 ports, and 14 airports or terminals.
Et tout ce que vous voyez aujourd'hui à Kinshasa,
everything you see today in Kinshasa, 90% or 80% of it, are infrastructures built in cooperation with China.
The development strategies of China and Africa are compatible. They have their respective resources and capabilities that enable cooperative development, a historic opportunity.
There are many Western critics of Western aid that have said that all the Western aid that has been given to Africa has been ineffective, and sometimes even promoting corrupt governments which exploit the aid for their own benefit. What's your perspective of the traditional Western aid, and has China learned some of those lessons?
There are several differences between China and the West, the way doing things. The first one is how to look at Africa. In the 2000s, while the economists published a column entitled Hopeless Continent, described Africa. But exactly in the same year, China's FOCAC started. So that's a different perspective, how to look at this. And I always say Africa, although just half a century, but African full of potential, that's first. And the second difference is the West. I don't know how they got this sense. Always, in the donor-recipient relations, one is, up, another is down. And also, I think that sense is not correct.
That's one lesson that China should learn from the experiences of the past colonialist or imperialistic powers. It has to be done in a transparent way. It has to be the decision, or it has to be decided by the local people whether a certain project that they wish to aid is in fact for the long-term interests of the local people. There's no altruistic or totally altruistic foreign aid, but China, nor should there be. Of course, but China needs to be careful that such foreign aid is not perceived as a purely self-serving, atavistic kind of venture. For example, I think in terms of infrastructure development in certain regions, especially the poorer regions in Africa or even Asia, I think those things are good. They don't have any political or ideological nature per se, right? So those are the kind of projects I think that China should be able to support and for example, with their newly formed bank, infrastructure bank. I mean, I think that can be positively viewed.
China has already seen the way Western developed countries help developing countries and is aware of the result, as well as many problems caused to those who receive help. So I think we should learn two important lessons. We have actually talked a lot about how China should avoid heading the same direction. The first lesson is that we should respect the choices of those countries. As we outsiders offer assistance, we are merely given some external help. To put it in the Chinese way, you're doing nothing but offering a helping hand. Ultimately, you should inspire the countries to unleash their own potential. The second lesson is that as we observe practices of developed countries, we see that America and European countries always force their own ways of doing things on countries that receive help from them. From some macro-level concepts to concrete actions, and even the models for operating and managing companies. This is what we call assistance with preconditions. These developed countries are forcing developing countries to accept their way of doing things, which we really can't agree with. For China, we would rather hand over specific projects to local governments while we try our best to offer help. Let's say you have this and that project, and let's do it one by one. We will not set up any standards or bargain for any conditions. We'll never ask others to copy China's practices or take China's model. So these are two lessons we learn from developed countries as they offer assistance to developing ones.
Let me give you another criticism, that is China has been supporting the political regimes that are not only dictatorships, but are oppressive dictatorships that rob their own people, and that China's view of just doing business with regimes like that is a moral outrage. What is China's response?
I would say China is a country had the history of humiliation, as well as the invasion. So we are very sensitive of this sovereignty, and also this outside interference. I'm not quite sure we would be very successful, because sometimes people suffer, right? And also China did not just watch, and a good example is Darfur. China's the President Bashir, said no foreign troops to Sudan, and I think after Hu Jintao, talk with him and make some. That's a kind of friendly suggestion. And behind the door, so because sovereignty is very important. As a friend, I give you some suggestion. This will be better for your country and for your own situation. So later he invited the hybrid, troops as a peacekeeping in his country, right? So we have to use more subtle and more respect to others.
China's also providing healthcare and peacekeeping, other kinds of non-economic things, which are certainly, I'm sure, appreciated.
Major type is Chinese medical team. It started in 1963, and when Algeria in 1962, the French withdrew and defeated, actually, so withdrew everything. So the Algeria government has sent the call for the international community who need some help. So China immediately sent the delegation to investigate, and then sent the medical team the next year. So now this medical team is spread to the whole continent, I think 47 countries. And of course the Ebola, when other countries facing the Ebola, he said, our diplomats go home, or Chinese diplomats stay there. And when other people say, no, the airplane stopped, China sent a special airplane to carry all these things.
In March 2014, the outbreak of Ebola in several African countries, especially Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, caught the world off guard. In just a few months, the virus claimed thousands of lives. After the World Health Organization sounded a global alarm, China immediately sent emergency medical aid.
The situation is quite severe, far beyond the capability of those affected countries. Time is life. The international community should take action now.
Over that summer, China's efficiency was recognized. The Chinese government rented 23 airplanes, flying over 3 continents and through the airspace of 18 countries to transport medical aid to the affected countries. In the face of one of the most virulent infections of the 21st century, more than 1,000 Chinese experts and military medical staff went to the affected countries, risking their own lives to treat and cure local people.
China was the first to send support to Liberia through a charter plane that took medical equipment and supplies. China also built an Ebola training unit that was managed by the Chinese military, and in that way perhaps brought global attention to the seriousness of our tragedy. So let me, through this medium, say thank you to China for giving us that very early lift.
In September 2015, the WHO declared that the Ebola outbreak would come to an end this year. But China's efforts on the continent continue.
From emerging powers to expanding partnerships, from fighting poverty to combating climate change, booming economies, war-ravaged nations, and everything in between. We capture the changes affecting the most dynamic and diverse continent on the planet, taking you beyond the headlines to the people and their stories. Asia Today, delivering Asia to the world. Culture Express. See the world in color.
If before President Xi Jinping's trip to Africa, he and his advisors asked your advice about what would be the most important things to be saying, be doing, be promising on his trip to Africa, what are the kinds of things you would say?
We need to consolidate the base, especially the people-to-people contact. And also, of course, I would say more technological transfer to introduce in Africa and really, promote both sides. And Xi Jinping, the president, always say we should make cake bigger, right?
If you look to the future, what would be the danger points, the challenges that you would advise China to be aware of? You know what the problems are, but which would be the hottest potential problems that you should pay attention to make sure that they don't get really bad?
Oh, I would say, look at China, inside China, those so-called let some people get rich first, right? Those rich people, they started to play around, play their games and show kind of arrogance and all this kind of thing. I would say China, Africa, somebody that is unbalanced, relation or whatever. I'd always say Africans have great civilizations. Otherwise, when the Aborigines in Australia, the culture perished almost. Indians in America almost perished. But African, after 400 years of slave trade and 100 years of colonialism, the culture spread all over the world. That shows the endurance and strength of African culture. There are something we also can learn from Africa. More than 50 countries, important international arena, they give one voice. That's very unique. No other, this regional organization, nobody can do that. The former Undersecretary of UN and the Brahimi, he said China and Africa should not just get on the solidarity. They should start to change or make the rule, international rule. I think that's a very good point because, some international rules are made half a century ago, right? So it's out of date and African, at that time, there's only one or two independent countries. Now it's a whole continent. So they should, the international community should bring them in the policy-making process. And that in that aspect, China can help.
If Africa is the future, China is prescient. China has contributed substantially to African development, and Africans are largely appreciative. China-African relations are now considered a strategic partnership. President Xi Jinping calls for win-win cooperation, and the directive is timely because all is not rosy. China's economy is slowing. Global commodity prices have dropped. Moreover, some African nationalists worry about exporting natural resources. Some African business people complain about Chinese imports. There have been tensions between Chinese and African workers, and some African opposition leaders decry China doing business with corrupt regimes. China's view is that its commercial activities and aid packages do not come with strings or political tests, and China is working hard to build schools and infrastructure as well as pump oil and mine minerals. Critically, China is assisting African countries in their industrialization and agriculture modernization. Other issues include wildlife protection, prohibiting the sale of ivory, to which China has become more sensitive, and an expansion of Chinese private sector investment. Watch Africa to keep closer to China.